Good evening to one and all. In the previous video, we discussed about the friction, frictional force and sliding friction. What is friction? Friction means the resistance to the movement of one body over the surface of the another body. The resistance to the movement of one body over the surface of the another body. Frictional force, the force which opposes the relative motion of the two surfaces of bodies are in contact is called frictional force. What is meant by sliding friction? This sliding friction means the friction which comes into play when the surface of one body moves relative to the surface of another body. Today we are going to discuss about to understand the nature of the friction and the concept of static friction. For this, we do one activity, that is, we do one activity. In this activity, aim is understanding the nature of the friction and concept of static friction. In this activity, we need some materials. Those are materials required: toy trolley, pulley, weight hanger, weights, wooden block, and inextensible string. Inextensible string means not extended string. Not extended string. See here, this is the toy trolley, this is the wooden block, this is the inextensible string, this is the pulley, this is the weight hanger. Weight hanger, pulley, inextensible string, wooden block, toy trolley. Now take a small toy trolley and a wooden block. Keep it on the trolley. And an extensible string is tied to the trolley and another end is fixed with the weight hanger. Now it is passed in the extensible string is passed over the pulley, over the surface of the pulley. Now we keep a small weight on the weight hanger. What will happen in the position of the wooden block and toy trolley? Is there any change in the motion of the trolley and wooden block? The wooden block fall or moving with the trolley? Here we notice that the trolley keep the wooden block at a rest position with an acceleration towards the left. And here we identify the wooden block. Wooden block is in rest position with respect to surface of the trolley. Wooden block at a rest position with respect to surface of the trolley. It is in motion with respect to the surface of the table. Now, increasing the weights on the weight hanger. What will happen? We observe the motion of the toy trolley and wooden block. Here toy trolley always tries to keep a wooden block at a rest position. Thus, the force of friction by the trolley on the wooden block. It acts on the wooden block in the direction of the motion. At the same time, this wooden block also applied the force on the trolley. But in opposite direction with respect to its friction. Static friction is defined as the friction which comes into play. The surfaces of bodies are at rest relative to each other. Is called static friction. What is meant by static friction? The friction which comes into play, the surfaces of the bodies are at rest relative to each other. This is the concept of the static friction, and this is also one type of friction. We have sliding friction and static friction. Static friction means the friction which comes into play, the surfaces of bodies are at rest relative to each other. Here we observe two sliding friction and static friction also exists. The sliding friction exists between trolley and table. The sliding friction exists between trolley and table. The static friction exists between wooden block and trolley. This is the concept of the static friction. What we do? Take some small toy trolley and wooden block and pulley and weight hanger. Then the inaccessible string is tied to the trolley and another one is weight hanger. It is passed over the pulley. Then we identify there is no change in the position of the wooden block and trolley. That means there exists a relative motion between the trolley and wooden block. This is the concept of the static friction. Now we are observing variation of friction. That means, see here, observation of variation of friction. Here, see the first picture. A boy tried to push the heavy box, but there is no change in the position of the box because here the frictional force is equal to applied force. The frictional force is equal to applied force. So the box does not move. In the second picture, here there is also box does not move because here the frictional force balances the applied force. Here the frictional force balances the applied force. So there is also box does not move. In third picture, there exists a limit of static friction. In third picture, see here. In third picture, there exists a limit of static friction. So here the applied force at some point. Here the frictional force, the applied force is more than the static friction. So the heavy box starts to move. This is the variation of the friction. Today, what we have learned? What is friction? Frictional force, sliding friction, and the understanding the nature of the friction and the concept of the static friction. Which materials are required to this activity? Materials required to toy trolley, pulley, weight hanger, and weights, wooden block, friction. Variation of friction. Okay, we will meet again in the next video.